it's called. It also links me to directly to the subject of our webinar today, time traveling. I mean, time exists obviously in in two incarnations. Or there is a kind of physical, scientific category of time, mathematical maybe, and there is an abstract one, which is kind of emotional, artistic, and so on. And obviously, we'll be dealing more with this with the second one. Uh, with the latter than with the former, but you never know. They sometimes come together very closely. I can tell you more. If you look at time as a category, as an abstract, as a category of the soul, probably, you can say that whatever we do is time traveling. I wanted to say that every travel is traveling in time because every travel happens in the past, and we all live in the present moment of the past, as someone said. Interestingly, I saw that slogan in Ireland, deep in the Irish countryside, several years ago when I was researching my book about Ireland, near the town of Tulsk, which sounded suspiciously Russian, you know. So there was this sign on an old barn or somewhere or a garage. We all live in the present moment of the past, and I think it's very true. But if so, then whatever we do is traveling in time because our every memory, our every gesture, every step, you know, immediately becomes the past, you know. So we are time traveling all the time. Uh, but well, today I wanted actually to tell you about well, serious time traveling, you know, not just metaphoric ones, but the one that I really believe exists and is achievable by everyone. Um, and this has a lot to do with the fact that time is a relative category as well. And obviously, we all heard of the theory of relativity uh, uh, by Albert Einstein, but you probably don't understand it. And Einstein himself once said that he who thinks that he understands the theory of relativity is wrong, you know, because it's pretty hard to understand, but it still exists. So time is probably one of the most relative concepts you can think of. And Mount Tessus is a very good example here because time as such does not exist in Mount Tessus. And I'm not just talking about the fact that they still live according to the Julian calendar, which is 13 days behind our Gregorian calendar. So obviously here when we have the new year, you know, they still at almost 2 weeks. They still almost 2 weeks to go to the new year, and they celebrate it later. And we here in the Gregorian will be celebrated for the second time. Then in Russia we used to call it Old New Year, so which was a much more pleasant kind of more intimate celebration. So, but it's not just that. If to forget about the calendar, the time, daily time does not exist because in some monasteries they put the clock at midnight at sunset. In other monasteries they put the clocks at well at midnight at sunrise. And in other monasteries, you know, there's probably even more confusion. They put the clock wherever they want and whenever they want, you know. So basically, uh, making any appointment in that place is an absolutely hopeless business. But the monks who measure their times in prayers and work, of course, but prayers, you know, like the morning prayer lasts for 8.5 hours. For example, the chants, you know, they don't really care. And they probably believe that God is flexible, and he probably is, you know. Never met him, but from what they told me. So basically, there is a place, Mount Estes, where time does not exist. And if you are there, you are a time traveler, clean and pure and authentic time traveler, because you travel in time every moment when you find yourself there. We can also remember the time zones of the world. I mean, some of these time zones appeared, you know, without much consideration for the areas, you know, they were running through, or for the people who lived in there. It was a geographical category. It used to be, so you cannot really change it. It was all calculated, but sometimes it was not calculated very well, it seems, because otherwise we wouldn't have such unbelievable uh, curios, you know, of time zones as, for example, a little country called Newer. Niue. It's a kind of an island in the Pacific, and it is an associate state of New Zealand. What is an associate state? Is basically it is New Zealand, apart from the fact that it's not New Zealand, because all its people are New Zealand citizens and New Zealand rules it. But it's called associate state, 1,600 people, and it is not very close to New Zealand. It's not that far. The nearest island of Tonga is 600 kilometers away, which is 1 hour flight. And nevertheless, this little country is 23 hours behind Tonga in official time, which basically, if you fly uh, from Tonga to that country, what happens? You lose completely the whole day of your life. 1 hour flight plus 23 hours difference. So the day goes uh, bump, basically, and disappears. Kaboom. Because these people, of that island, they still travel to New Zealand. Their own diaspora counts 20,000 people, which is like 10.5 times more people than live on the island itself. They're very unhappy about it, and they presented a petition to the parliament. Last year, parliament had a meeting, but decided not not to introduce any changes. So they still remain 23 hours behind the other parts of their country. But there are also places in the world. I mean, there are quite a lot of them. And in this atlas that I finished compiling several months ago, I described them all in detail. But the most memorable ones, quite a lot of them, for some reason, in Australia. And I think probably having lived in Australia for some time, I think I may know why, because of this no worries mate attitude. They don't really care, uh, whether they're on time or not. They're not very punctual. But also Aboriginals, they're kind of local people who are there for thousands of years. They don't have the category of time. They don't understand it. And one of my Australian friends, a nice lady, a teacher, she complained they had an Aboriginal gentleman who would come to play with her children and play didgeridoo and so on. And when he would come, he could stay for a week, just forgetting about everything, or he could stay for 2 minutes, and leave. So, so they started avoiding him after a while because, well, it's 2 minutes is all right, but probably when someone stays a week and plays didgeridoo for a week, it's pretty hard to take. So, in Australia, there are a number, not one, but a number of towns. They don't have villages in Australia; they have towns. In one state, bordering normally on another state, like for example, Coolangatta, which is in Queensland, and it borders, I think, in South Australia, with a difference of 45 minutes to the nearest town in South Australia. It's quite a number have half-hour difference. Uh, how that appeared, there's an explanation in each case, normally connected to Australian railways, which have never been very punctual and precise. I know it from my own experience. Um, so they kind of adjusted to the convenience of railways and trains all this time. So the time still remain, which creates quite unbelievable difficulties, but also some conveniences. For example, uh, with another town on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, which has another, it's actually a town split into two by the border, with a 1 hour difference between two parts of the town. So if you're late somewhere, if you live in one and work in another, you always have, well, not an hour, but almost an hour probably at your disposal, basically, um, to be in time, even if you're late. Um, so actually, I gave you the example of that island in the Pacific, but you don't have to go very far to find this interesting kind of discrepancies in time and things you can do. Like there are several places in the world, let's get back to the new year, where you can actually celebrate the new year twice within a very short period of time. I did it myself, I have to confess, in year 1992 to 93, where I worked in the European newspaper, and they sent me to cover, they were supposed to have some kind of reunification, that not the final one, but, some kind of removal of some kind of borders or taboos, which none of which worked in the end, as you can see now, because of Brexit. But this restriction should have been in, invalid from midnight on the 31st of December 1992. And they sent me basically the European newspaper on a cruise, special cruise, which would leave Dover shortly before the English New Year. I think so. Yeah, we meet the English New Year in the sea, in the British waters. Then we come back. Sorry, the French New Year in the waters of the Channel. Then come to for a short while to Calais, take some passengers. It was 40 minutes crossing, just to be in time for the English New Year back in Dover. So that was quite fun actually, and I was thinking long and hard how I could report it, what I should do. Then I wrote that in that black hole, in that time loop when we were, while we were back in La Manche and the English Channel, you could meet some interesting characters from the past, probably. So I managed to interview Napoleon and Hitler, both of whom tried to unite Europe as well, and you know what happened in each case. So yeah, I have the Napoleon with a spyglass on the deck, and Hitler, playing a gambling machine, and I kind of had two exclusive interviews with those two well, not gentlemen, those two men, I would say. So here we go. So I basically, what I did, I took the category of time literally, and made it into an abstraction, basically, that was still quite understandable to many people. And yeah, I think that was, as a result, quite a nice article. So time, again, is a very lucrative category for different kind of dictators, who like to show their powers by showing their control of everything, including time. And we have famous examples of Chavez, for example, again, changing the time zone of Venezuela, by half an hour, or Turkmenbashi, also reducing the length of the week and of the year, in Turkmenistan, the father of Turkmen, and so on and so, and so on and so forth. Also, if you take, for example, such countries like as China and India, they decide they're quite vast countries, so they could accommodate lots of time zones. But in actual fact, both China and India have only one time zone each. Again, for the convenience of, I would say, definitely not of the citizens, who have to call it morning when it is actually dusk already sometimes behind the windows, but for the comfort of the rulers, and of the planners. Well, India, I can understand it, kind of poverty. They didn't want to create probably extra problems for themselves. But in China, it's kind of a totalitarian decision, I would say. So to have such vast country as one time zone is a bit silly. Uh, and there are opposite examples and similar examples as well. The other one I wanted to give is, well, Russia, of course, we know that it has 12 time zones. Only one more than the United States, which has 11. And the Trans-Siberian Railway alone has 8 time zones and runs through 8 time zones, so the difference is 8 hours between Moscow and Vladivostok. But by some kind of interesting regulation, all stations on Trans-Siberian Railway function according to Moscow time, and the clocks, again, they show 9 o'clock in the evening, when it's actually probably only 11 o'clock in the morning in actual fact. And that's always kind of struck me as rather bizarre. So when we start thinking that we can change time or rule over time, we make a very big mistake. Also, interestingly enough, the country, the nation, let's say, that has probably the biggest number of times, I think 13 or 14. It used to be Britain. Yeah, the sun would never set in the British Empire. Yeah, that's what we heard. Now these days it is France actually. But the sun never sets on France, on the French Empire, because its dominions still spread around, on a quite a vast territory. And so it's kind of, although they're mostly smallish ones, but still, the sun never sets over France. So that's the time zones. The way, well, travel writers and simply writers deal with time. Well, deserves and travelers, which should be closer to the subject of our seminar, of our webinar, it is a separate issue. I, for example, once claimed that, well, I know how to do time traveling. And how did I do it? I started traveling some time ago, more than 30 years ago now, only with guidebooks, which are at least 100 years old. Yeah, I think most modern guidebooks are actually pretty bad because they sap the joy out of travel. So what I did, I decided, okay, what if I travel for the millennium anniversary? And I came, when I worked in the telegraph, I said, I want to travel around Britain with the Baedeker guide, which is 100 years old, 1893. And they said, okay, it's quite an interesting idea. So what are you going to do? I said, well, I'll try to stick to the same kind of means of transport and so on, not to fly, which I think I did manage not to fly, but not to use telephone too much, not to kind of listen to the radio too much, all these kind of things. And why, basically? What was the purpose of it? It's not just to have fun. I think by sticking to the old old guidebooks and old reference book, old gazetteers, which I mentioned a little bit later, you create for yourself what I call the carcass of time. Just imagine the carcass. You can see in butcher shop there's a carcass. So when they build a house, they start with the carcass with the beam, with emptiness inside. Yeah. So it is the carcass of time which stays there. Like, it can be anything. It can be the price of a ferry, say from Holyhead to the Isle of Man, for example, or the time it takes to take a horse carriage, in Moscow from one of the stations to Tverskaya Street, or anything else, or little marks left by the travelers 100 years ago on the margins. Or sometimes you find some little gems like an old, really very old ferry ticket or something else. So in those books, and suddenly if you stick to them and forget, so you stick to them, but obviously because you're not mad, you cannot believe them 100%. Yeah, because otherwise you'll be in trouble. And then you look up from the book and look around, and then suddenly this carcass of time gets filled with the new contents, with our modern reality, And by combining the two, you actually make this metaphorical leap back in time. And of course, if you have imagination, which Einstein said is more important than knowledge, and in a certain sense, I do believe it. Well, that's where actually time traveling happens, and I could give you a lot of examples. So I started doing it, and I enjoyed it. I did the series of articles called Baedeker Raids. Baedeker Raids, as you know, that's what German Luftwaffe pilots were calling their raids to bomb Britain. Quite cynically, because they would take a Baedeker guidebook. Baedeker was a German, of course, but well, he had nothing to do with the Nazis. Actually, in the end, the family had something to do. I'll mention it shortly. But the first Baedeker, kind of Karl Baedeker, the first, who published his guidebook in 1819 here, I think so. And yeah, Murray was a year earlier. The British guidebook publisher, John Murray, he had nothing to do with them. So the Germans used his guidebooks of Britain, later guidebooks, of course, to find the objects that deserved, from their point of view, that reverse bombing, like cathedrals, like some kind of valuable churches, and so on and so forth. But my Baedeker raids, it was a bit probably kind of cynical to call it like that, but I explained immediately that my Baedeker raids had nothing to do with that. They were just trying to look at modern Britain with the eyes of a travel of 100 years ago. And that concept worked. And those of you who live in this country, they probably know that, well, they don't know that actually the BBC and Michael Portilla simply nicked this idea after a while, because in 1999, 2000, 2001, these pieces in the Telegraph were quite popular. Yeah, so lots of people read them and so on. And I did several little pieces for the BBC, also traveling with an old guidebook, you know, and making comments and so on. And then suddenly, well, uh, ideas can be nicked. There's no copyright for ideas. So the BBC sent Michael Portillo there in his orange trousers, you know, to do the same sort of thing with lots of resources, lots of money and so on. But you don't really need a lot of resources. You need just a little old book and a pair of eyes and some knowledge, maybe of history, and the desire to travel. And then you basically travel in time. I've written a couple of books using the same method, you know, because I can call it, it's my method. Um, I wrote the book Vitaly's Island using old Murray's guidebook, because Bedecker actually never did an island guidebook, as it turned out, but Murray did. It was actually interesting, the relationship between these two great guidebook writers. And why were they both great? Because unlike The Lonely Planet, they wanted the traveler to be creative, to do some work, you know, so they wouldn't tell you everything about the place. Sometimes they would quote a place or a name, and without explaining what it is about or an expression in a foreign language, they expected you to do some work, you know. They would steer you in the right direction, and that was it. From that point of view, they were ideal guidebooks, you know. They didn't write about food at all. I mean, the early editions, 19th century and early 20th century, the food did not exist. At that time, sport existed only as hunting, maybe a bit of fishing. So that was outside those guidebooks, whereas modern guidebooks, they have probably more than 90% of their context. Some of them is just about food and other kind of uh, perishable, I would say, things, not great monuments and sites. And Baedeker decided to give stars to not just the objects, the hotels and so on, but to the views as well. He was very much into walking, you know, he liked walking. And so he started grading views by stars. And that's where this 5-star, 3-star thing came from. Murray disputed that. He said that he was the first one to start grading objects. It's very interesting to read the letters to each other, because I once visited the headquarters of modern Baedeker guidebooks, Baedeker Verlag, in lost somewhere in the kind of cabbage fields near Stuttgart. Modern offices, you know, modern Baedekers, of course, you know, they can't even come close. I can't compare with the old ones, which are so much better and so much more independent, uh, because he always, Baedeker inspectors always traveled incognito, you know, they never announced themselves, they paid for everything, of course, just like Simon Calder does now, claims to be doing now. Whereas Murray accepted hospitality, and that's why Murray's guidebooks have ads. Of course, they had two different approaches, and they were quite at odds with each other, these two respectable gentlemen. And if you read their letters to each other, they were all kind of very formal, extremely polite. My dear sir, all this kind of thing. Let me kindly, blah, 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 blah. But actually, inside those letters, quite serious arguments, because each of them claimed that the other one keeps stealing, you know, stuff from himself, and he was the first to use this and that, you know. It's quite fun. So I saw the correspondence in the lovely archives of that very Baedeker Verlag publishing house near Stuttgart, which I was lucky to visit, incidentally doing a little BBC thing, BBC television report for them, for BBC News 24, the channel that doesn't exist anymore. So why were they great? Because they, both of them, particularly I prefer Baedeker, frankly, although, as I said, sometimes you have to travel with Murray, where Baedeker didn't go to certain places. He never means his words, you know, and he was always very open. And when he said that, you know, that most of French hotels are filthy uh, and abound in bed bugs and stuff like that, which used to be the case, or that certain hotel owners are very rude and foul-mouthed. You know, he just called a spade a spade. And it was stuff like that that he quoted, because that was really useful at that time. He famously advised travelers in Arabia, you know, in the Middle East at that time, not not to follow local women, you know, and he did it with such kind of knowledge of the subject that one could be forgiven for believing that Baedeker himself tried to follow, to quote local women and failed and got into trouble. Uh, so just such a pleasure to read it. And when you travel with them, believe me, you do travel in time. You do travel in time with a bit of imagination. Uh, yeah, you've seen some of the photos from my collection, and one of them is probably one of the rarest. Actually, I thought it was the rarest Baedeker's Russia in English. He published in French, German, and English. So that one was in English, 1914 edition of Baedeker's Russia. Well, not a very good year to publish a guidebook. So that's why it became rated. Only one edition in English, and if you were to buy the original these days, it would set you back probably about £10,000. Well, what you saw there, what I have, is a facsimile reprint, which was also quite expensive, but several £100, but nothing like that, of course. But the rarest of Baedeker's and the most expensive one was actually a German guidebook published during the Second World War, and it's called Generalgouvernement. And also only one edition, and that one included Poland and all the occupied territories of Europe. But as I said, because it was luckily not very long lasting kind of period, Baedeker was allegedly, they twisted his hands. He didn't want to do it. But, you know, it was Baedeker number 10 already then. Most of them were called Karls, actually. Karl Baedeker. Those 3, 4, 5 of them, and other Baedekers as well. So that one kind of agreed to do it for the Nazis, and this is still a big kind of a stigma on Baedeker's reputation because of that. And that guidebook is literally priceless. And I have to say, I never forgive, you know, there's certain things in your life which you kind of never forgive yourself for doing. And Christine can confirm, we were kind of a little book fair in Nedworth Park here, and there's some old books. And there was this, suddenly I saw this Generalgouvernement. Well, I don't speak German, you know, that's one thing, you know. And it was priced at £180, which was like a real steal, you know, because you might probably, if I were into selling anything, you know, I could sell it 100 times more expensive quite easily. But then I thought, oh, well, it's still a lot of money for me, you know, and I don't speak German and so on and so forth. So I decided not to buy it, and I can never forgive myself for that. A bit later, actually, I befriended a fellow collector of old guidebooks and maps in Switzerland, you know, called Fritz, you know, with whom we worked together on the piece about Swiss post buses. And he is a very kind fellow. He gave me a couple of books from his collection. And here we come to another very important kind of time traveling tool for me, old timetables. Mitya, if you could show some of the little timetables, and I'll explain about them. Yeah, that's actually, let me just go through what you see here. This is Murray's guide to Switzerland. Switzerland was favorite area for Baedeker and for Murray. So there are literally every year almost Baedeker had an edition on Switzerland, and Murray as a competitor had it as well. And I think Murray's book on Switzerland actually better from my point of view. Well, because obviously the English tourists were there first, as we all know. Now, these are two. One on the right is probably the rarest book I have, thanks to Fritz. This is a train timetable for my native Ukraine, for my native city of Kharkov, published during the Nazi occupation. You open this timetable. The other one is it looks similar, yeah, but there's nothing again to do with. It was just this style in Europe. It's Estonian, 1936 Estonian timetable, you know, which was, well, again, it soon was to be occupied first by the Soviet Union, then by Germany. But the timetables look similar, but obviously the one on the right is probably about 1 million times rarer than the one on the left. And what happens when you open it and see these little tables? It's all done in a very good order. You can actually travel from Berlin to Kharkov, you know, direct, and all the stations are marked. You know, all the German transcription is impeccable. So suddenly you get this feeling of this order, this horrible order, and then you remember what were they actually doing in Kharkov, those horrible things. And it all comes back to you, well, it all comes back to me. That's the magic power of books like those, So I started collecting train timetables a while ago, and still as a little boy. So I would look at them for hours. And now, obviously, here I got in touch with the people who make Cook's timetable. This is actually the list of railway stations of the USSR, plus the map of the USSR 1956, I think, a couple of years after I was born. And when Stalinism was pretty much in force, half of the stations are called after Stalin, the other half after Lenin. Well, and well, the third half, if there was such a thing, I called red something, red excavator, red whitewashing, whatever, It's quite interesting though, but because they have the old names too. So the whole US, I don't need to have a better kind of guidebook to the USSR. You cannot have a better time travel to the USSR, which doesn't exist anymore, than just looking at this book and the map. So that's how it works to me. There is also, on another photo, is a much newer volume, quite thick one, called Kurzbuch. Can we show it, Mitya? It's a blue one, blue thick volume here on the left, very blue. Yeah, it's called. It's basically it's rare. It's 2018, but it is, yes, here it is. That's about 1,000 pages. This timetable is the last print edition of famous Swiss Kurzbuch, which came out for many, more than definitely 100 years, in 4 volumes of that thickness. One for trains and ferries, which is this one, then 3 for buses, because Switzerland has the most extensive system of bus communications in the world, and most punctual, of course, everywhere. So this is a rarity, and Fritz sent it to me, and just told me to keep it because soon it will be extremely rare, because there will be no more course books like that. Maybe you have to save paper. That's true. So, but it's a bit of a shame. So you had a touch of Switzerland, opening it at this punctuality. They tell you how long it takes to walk from the train to the bus in minutes, and all these kind of unbelievable details, and they're all correct, and they're very seldom, well, they're never wrong, I could say, because every Swiss train timetable gets approved 4 years in advance, then gets a final revision 2 years later, and the very final revision, obviously, in another year, and it becomes really set in stone, and there are provisions for all kinds of things that can happen. So if something happens, in Switzerland, if a train is 10 minutes late, it is a national disaster. The Swiss constitution actually specifies the right to have punctual trains as one of the main citizens' rights in Switzerland. And I once heard a very peculiar announcement at a Swiss station with my own ears. And they said that the train on platform 9 is running 10 minutes late, and this is due to the incident in another country, believe it or not. So it was somewhere before the Swiss border, obviously. So Sweden had nothing to do with that, but they have provisions for all of this kind of mishaps. So again, no need to go to Switzerland, just look at Swiss wonderful train timetables and old guidebooks, of course. Next to the 3 Badekers, as you saw in the photograph, there was a manual of conversation, which Badeker also published. And I would strongly advise you to get manuals of conversations, which are at least 100 years old as well, because they tell you about the intonations and the realities of those countries better than any book of fiction or non-fiction. How to hire a servant, what to ask him, how to buy a horse. That's what all Badeker has. But this one actually is, I bought it quite accidentally in a little town in Italy. It's published in Italy. It's English-Italian conversation book published under Mussolini. So you see a little swastika here and so on. But I was trying very hard to find some kind of, pro-Mussolini stuff here, but I couldn't. But, well, there are some interesting little details about um, just talking to a military man, for example, and stuff like that, which are absolutely amazing. You cannot get it anywhere else, because you are talking to the real live environment of that country of all those years ago. Uh, well, travel with old guidebooks, with old conversation books, take all modern guidebooks, put in the big pile and burn. Never use them. Sorry. Well, we're probably going to work without a break today. I'll just have a sip of water. Well, another means of time traveling, probably have to be pretty brief about them all. There are, of course, things like we all know reenactments. Quite a lot of it's very popular occupation in Britain. I have several friends, several good friends who actually go on weekends, and get dressed as Roman soldiers or as some kind of medieval knights and so on, go into the field and fight each other, with other kind of crazy people like those. Well, which is fine. I mean, it's nice, it's better than maybe, going to a football match, sorry, God forgive me, or even sitting in a pub. But it really has very little to do with real history, with time traveling. Uh, Particularly in the United States, I saw it several times in Williamsburg. They're very proud of Williamsburg, but this kind of hands-on history, in America, you have to touch to be able to touch everything, to grab everything, and it all has really very little to do with history. Okay, you can have some soldiers, and you can fire a gun of a period, but also in the basement in Williamsburg of a former lunatic asylum, you can hear George Washington talking about his life, obviously a very tired actor who forgets his words, and he does it like 20 times a day, and then the audience asks him questions, so, Mr. President, how much do you earn, of course, or Mr. President, what is better, to be the president or the general, all this kind of thing. This is, I would say, is simplification and trivialization even of history. And they publish a newspaper. They're saying today is the 7th of November, 1769 or something like that. Um, all the news and all the ads there. This is kind of easy to do, but there are exceptions. There are places that do it in an extremely tasteful way. And one of the best was actually one of the best things in Australia, actually, where I live. There's near Melbourne, they have the whole gold miners town called Sovereign Hill. Do you have a photo, Mika, of that? Which I've been made an honorary citizen of it. I can come to Sovereign Hill. I have a piece of paper somewhere anytime with as many people I want to bring. So you can all go for free. It's quite expensive there. It's beautiful because there is not a single false note. There are actors, wandering the streets playing, local residents, professional actors, good actors. I spoke with them, and they can talk to you about all the issues of gold mining and stuff. If you stuff, that's what they're for. But the main thing that I love, they reproduce not just the buildings and even the people there, but they reproduce smells, and smells are very powerful time traveling tool. How do they do it? They have, for example, an old smithery then, and an old sweets making factory, and they all use the old tools and all the authentic ingredients, all the authentic instruments and so on, and like a joinery, it smells, like it used to smell 200 years ago, or the smithery, or some kind of other tool where they fix horse carriages and horse manure and so on. So you kind of come to this place and you get enveloped by these smells, some of them not very pleasant, but they're authentic, and suddenly something happens, and suddenly you do get transferred in time. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of places like that. Again, come back to America, it's quite a funny story. They tend to exaggerate it sometimes to impress you. When I was on my kind of long travels to America, when I was following in the footsteps of brilliant Soviet writers, Ilf and Petrov, probably won't have time to talk about that, but maybe in passing I'll mention it. So I decided to visit the house of one of my favorite kind of writers of all time, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, in Hartford, Connecticut, where I actually had to visit. It's one of the oldest newspapers, the oldest newspaper in the USA. Hartford Courant is published there. So I went, I saw the editor-in-chief, and so on, and obviously I said I wanted to see the Mark Twain Museum, and they said, oh, we'll arrange it. And they obviously made some phone calls like in the Soviet Union, and they overdid it. So anyway, what happened was it's a really lovely house. Here it is. I'd never seen this kind of chiaroscuro, sun and shade. It was autumn, New England autumn, so whatever green you see here, just, forget about it. It's all golden, brown and red. And next to it is a house of Harriet Beecher Stowe, by the way, with whom Mark Twain was very friendly, and so it's like playing pranks on her as well, though, but that's a different story. So, and I was alone in that house, and they even, there are no guys, they all left. I said, well, Vitaly, you can do whatever you like, go and play on Samuel Clemens billiard, sit at his desk, type at his typewriter. I said, wow, no, that's too much. I won't. No, I can't. They said, no, come on, feel free, So, and I went to his study. I saw all the kind of sunshine, basically, on the billiards, and it all looked alive, really looked alive, and even the smell of good pipe, was there, good pipe tobacco. So I got completely carried away, and that just it was too much for me emotionally. So I said, no, that's too much, Started walking down the stairs, and suddenly, towards me, there comes Mark Twain, smoking a pipe. And from behind his back, there peeps out, a guy that says, and now, Vitaly, meet Sam. I think the fact that I didn't have a heart attack then was only, a big stroke of luck to me, because I was not ready for that. I think I did nearly fell down the stairs. And Tom, please next time warn me if you're about to do something like that. So that, of course, kind of made me forget about all the wonderful things I saw them. An opposite example was in the house of another favorite writer of mine, Anton Chekhov, in Russia and America many years ago. And that was really authentic. And they had this amazing director. I forgot his name now. He was an old man. He and his wife lived and looked after Chekhov's house all their lives. And they kept everything in top order, Yeah, it is the one, well, this monument is a new thing. I think that does look very well. I mean, Chekhov was a very good gardener, and he said, had I not been a writer, I would become a gardener. So this lovely garden, and he grew a lot of vegetables as well in his plot. But the thing that struck me most, and that's actually the director said, Vitaly, you see the door handles here, they're all authentic. They all remember Anton Chekhov's touch, and please, touch them and hold them for some time, because that you're touching Chekhov's hand. And that was, again, another amazing occasion where something happened. There was a kind of a spark, that went through my body, and suddenly I was shaking Chekhov's hand. But of course, had it been in a kind of a kitschy modern environment, no door handle would help, but everything else was kept with utmost care and love, so that's a means of time traveling as well, visiting the places of your favorite writers, touching door handles. I would recommend it very much. Always touch door handles and touch old books. I make sure that I touch the back, the spine of an old book, and I have plenty of them. I could probably do a special several webinars just talking about my old books, because by doing so, you touch eternity itself. You touch time, and you kind of make a leap into the past. I was supposed to tell you a little bit about one of my favorite books of all time, called The Scientific Romance by Ronald Wright, a modern British writer who lives in Canada. And that's it's beautifully written. It's about, well, his hero fixes Herbert Whale's time machine, and goes 500 years into the future. And that's why it is interesting, because uh, it was kind of, I read somewhere that, well, traveling into the future is theoretically possible, whereas traveling into the past is next to impossible, for obvious reasons. So this book, takes us 500 years into the future, into London, which is a tropical climate, and palm trees and monkeys jumping, everywhere. No people, all in ruins. Several pandemics, several wars, and the hero David Lambert, who is an archaeologist, he starts walking from the ruined Dartford crossing bridge, which is described, the beautiful language, he's just kind of Nabokov-like almost style and prose, beautiful writer. For some reason, he's quite acclaimed, but not as acclaimed as he should be. So he starts walking along the ruins of A1 motorway towards Scotland, and among all this tropical flora and fauna, he befriends a Black Panther, for example, on the way, calls him Graham, and then it turns out to be a she, actually, and quite embarrassingly, but well, she Graham, and then he reaches Scotland, and when I did a column about this book recently, and I had to stop there because I don't think they would probably publish it there, because what he found in Scotland was some people, yes, and they were black people, black Scots, they were all black, with the names like Kwama Mackenzie, for example. And they lived in Stone Age, basically New Stone Age. They bred llamas, and called them sheep and so on and so forth. But this is just a detail, I think black Scotsman probably, I don't know who would publish this now these days, but still, it kind of makes sense, and they were interesting people. But the authenticity of his description of this kind of post-apocalyptic landscape was just absolutely unbelievable. So I read it about 5 or 6 times, and I want to get away from it all. It always does it to me. So that's what I say. Good book is another time traveling tool. Just like, for example, I wanted to tell you more about visiting book towns, because I used to be very friendly with Richard Booth, who founded this Hay and Wye, the first book town in the world, and he was a man of a different time, different century. There, if you dig yourself in old books for a couple of days, then Hay and Wye with its 96 bookshops and nothing else really. So then 21st century and 20th century all disappear. It's one of my favorite places in the world. I'm about to revisit it in a couple of weeks' time, researching my next book on Britain's utopias, by the way. But I want to finish, I want to finish very briefly again, telling you about my travels in the United States and the footsteps of my favorite writers again. I have lots of favorite writers. They're definitely among the top 5. Ilya Ilf and Yevgeny Petrov, Soviet satirists of 1930s, late 1920s, both died young. Luckily for them, because otherwise they would have been killed by Stalin, of course. But, even Stalin couldn't kill someone who was dead already. They were both not, one of them died of tuberculosis at 39, and the other one was, died during the Second World War, in 1942. Absolutely wonderful, talented guys, wrote the funniest and probably the most profound books I ever seen. And they visited America in 1935, 36, bought a car. It was possible to them, drove, across and back, and wrote this beautiful book, which they called, in Russian, it was called Одноэтажная America, One-Storied America. In an English translation, they thought One-Storied America was probably not great enough, using Trump's kind of mentality, which was there after the Great Depression, probably. So they called it Little Golden America, to echo one of the novels very popular in America, Little Golden Castle. So Little Golden America, or One-Storied America. And even now, this book is extremely topical. I offered it to the readers of I had a book club and my ENT column. So and they all discovered it, this kind of modern scientists and engineers, and came to the conclusion it was still extremely topical. It's funny, it's very kind-hearted and kind of good-hearted towards America, you know. So I'm still surprised it was published in the Soviet Union without any changes in 1935-36. I came very close. They had this driver called Mr. Adams, whose real name was, I think, Mr. Throne. Yeah, he was an American kind of communist, a Jewish communist, and his wife, who drove them across America. And they had a little baby, then daughter, and which nearly stopped them from accompanying Ilf and Petrov because they're a very eccentric, funny couple. And when I was, again, before my trip to America, I managed to locate that very baby, you know, who described, Ilf and Petrov described how in one of the scenes, this little girl, you know, in the Mickey Mouse apron runs out, and they start kissing each other, said, oh, mommy, mommy, daddy, daddy, you know, it's such a moving scene. So this little girl now lives in England, and she was, I think, in her 90s, and too old to talk to me. But her daughter, the daughter of the baby, actually, sorry, uh, the baby obviously was still in her kind of 70s or 80s, and I spoke with her. That was the baby. But her mother, who was actually the driver in Ilf and Petrov's expedition, yes, she was hardly alive then. And I could hear her voice, you know, her voice from another room. She was asking, who is that, and so on, because they had very hard time from Soviet perestroika journalists who were kind of accusing Ilf and Petrov totally and in a justified manner, all kinds of horrible things, you know, which was total rubbish. So she was a bit kind of scared that I was also had some connections there. I assured them I had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. So I came very close to, well, to their trip by speaking to actually their driver. Now, to cut a long story short, I traveled in their footsteps across America, being in Texas, I've been in Chicago. It was all published in the Telegraph, you know, and you can still read it in the archives. And all these stories, no, not all of them, but half of them are in my book, the bumper book of my travels. There will be another one, by the way, next year, probably a smaller one. So I'll publish the rest of them. But the peak of this kind of investigation, and when the time travel suddenly became full of meaning, was when in New York, by all different kinds of descriptions, you know, in their book, I managed to find the hotel where they stayed. So I'll read you. This is the last paragraph of this kind of New York piece. The light here is not very good, so I turn this way. No disrespect implied. On my last evening in New York, I took the elevator to the 27th floor of the Marriott East Side, formerly the Shelton Towers Hotel, where Ilf and Petrov stayed 65 years ago. It was quite hard to find out what happened to Shelton Towers Hotel, so but I managed to. The design of the hotel hasn't changed much, except for a tobacco stand in the vestibule, which disappeared without a trace. Obviously, America is non-smoking. Indeed, this day, a New York hotel is more likely to have a coffin store in the lobby than an un-PC tobacco stand. Erected in 1924 by Arthur Lewis Hammond, the acclaimed architect of the Empire State Building, the Sheldon was originally designed as a bachelor residence, but by 1935, it began accepting female guests and married men like Ilf and Petrov. Yeah, who were both married. In 1935, in their little rooms on the 27th floor, Ilf and Petrov could feel the warm wind, quotes, which wafted through the Atlantic Ocean, quote. They saw several skyscrapers which seemed so close that one could touch them with his hand, and their lighted windows could be counted. And further away, behind the dark unlighted swath, the Hudson, or was it the East River, is the quote as well, there gleamed a sheer gold dust of tiny lights. Despite the presence of several new high-rise stalagmites, the 1935 view remained largely unchanged. Down below, New York was steaming, bubbling, and heaving like a giant jacuzzi bath, left running overnight by a forgetful owner. A warm waft of eternity gently ruffled my hair as I looked at the sheer gold dust of tiny lights still dancing tirelessly in the distance behind the black ribbon of the Hudson, or was it indeed the East River? So that was kind of a complete uh, time travel transformation. I was really there in 1935, and I could feel it uh, very, very strongly. Uh, and I was thinking while I was reading, I think I should finish on some kind of a interesting ending because of that. Uh, yes, so basically, I think, well, again, I could have spoken about some other interesting attempts in time travel, like, for example, Dow project, which was done on Roman Abramovich's money, of course, only because they recreated completely in Krakow, my native city, the institute where my father actually worked, in 1930s, kind of 1940s part of it, with people living there for 2 years without being allowed out and wearing even authentic underwear. Do you have a photo, Mitya, of that back to the USSR somewhere, or back in the USSR? Yeah, and they basically the idea was to make about 700 movies in this background. Every person who worked on the project, and they worked like, waitresses, hairdressers, and so on. They lived. They were not allowed to live for 2 years. They signed contracts about not basically revealing what they saw to anyone. And another thing, not to pay any attention to cameras, to which they actually got used to, so because they were filmed at all times. So I don't think this project. Imagine what kind of money one needed to build this kind of thing of the past. It was all extremely authentic, though no one can deny it, because people would live into the atmosphere. As I said, one woman was telling me, the costumes, the bras, all the underwear had to be absolutely authentic from those times. And the couple of movies that I managed to see, they were quite impressive. But I think in its entirety, the project basically failed, which means again, you spending money, of course, can help, but it's not the main thing. The main thing, and we come back to where we started, is is the imagination, is the will to do it, the desire to do it, and well, maybe a little bit of knowledge too. Thank you very much.